And it's going to take us here. Why do you consider a child dying of cancer bad? What makes that bad to you? On what grounds do you consider things being good or bad? It seems that we have some fundamental moral instinct as to what is good and what is bad, and we speak often from that perspective. But where does it actually come from? By the way, this notion of a feeling will remind us of Freud's Civilizations and its Discontents, those opening lines especially about the oceanic feeling that Freud's going to be trying to address. Again, Emerson's ideas of this essay are going to have prodigious effect in the 20th, and I would argue the 21st century. He will continue when he says that the philosophy of 6,000 years has not searched the chambers and magazines of the soul. He says it, man is a stream whose source is hidden. Always our being is descending into us from we know not whence. The most exact calculator has no prescience, that somewhat incalculable may not bulk at the very moment. I'm constrained every moment to acknowledge a higher origin for events than the will I call mine. In other words, where does consciousness come from? Where does energy come from? This will be the fundamental question of Oversoul. Paragraph number 2. From some alien energy, the visions will come, he says. And then in paragraph number 3, he will begin to make his observation. The supreme critic on all the errors of the past and the present, and the only prophet of that which must be, is that great nature in which we rest as the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere, that unity, and then he uses it, that oversoul within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other, that common heart of which all sincere conversation is the worship, to which all right action is submission, that overpowering reality which confutes our tricks and talents. He continues, we live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime, within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, he calls it, the universal beauty to which every part and particle is equally related, and then he calls it the eternal one. In other words, go back to our lines from Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. Everything in this second box is actually one. In other words, Emerson will move from a certain kind of dualism to a monism. Everything in the end is one. Now again, whether this makes sense to you or not, you get to debate later, right? I just want to introduce you to the concepts. And this deeper power in which we exist and whose beatitude is all accessible to us is not only self-sufficing, self-sufficing, and perfect in every hour, but the act of seeing, again, we're back to that persicacity thing, and the things seen, the seer and the spectacle, the subject and the object are one. We see the world piece by piece as the sun, the moon, the animal, the tree, but the whole of which these are the shining parts is the soul. Now again, it's all about language. So for example, we ask about Ruthie's tree. How and in what ways are you similar to Ruthie's tree? Well, you're both energy, right? Now if I use the word energy, that makes sense to you. But what if I use the word soul or spirit? Now so you can kind of start to see, that's where the language starts to become problematic. And again, Emerson's going to point out, language always fails us when we start to talk about the metaphysical, the transphysical, something beyond the physical, right? He will finish this paragraph number 3 by saying, yet I desire, even by profane words, if sacred I may not use, to indicate the heaven of this deity, again he's going to call the soul the deity, right? And to report what hence I have collected of the transcendent, there's our word, simplicity and energy, there's our word, of the highest law. Now go ahead and look at that again and just notice that is his thesis. So for those of us who are learning to write, learning to read a well-formed thesis will help us, and there it is for him. In other words, he says, I'm very interested to talk about this thing called energy. I'm not going to shy away from it, even though it's difficult to define, nay, impossible to define. He says, I'm still going to try and do it. Okay, we finished with part 1. Now let's get to part 2. Part 2, of course, is paragraphs 4 through 10. This is the attempt to do what he can't do. And note the irony of this, it sounds very Socratic, right? I can't actually define it, but I'm going to go ahead and try anyway, all right? Paragraph number 4, this is the central paragraph in many ways of the essay. Let's read it. If we consider what happens in conversation, in reveries, in remorse, in times of passion, in surprises, in the instructions of dreams, we'll think of Freud, won't we? Wherein often we see ourselves in masquerade, the droll disguises only magnifying and enhancing a real element and forcing it on our distant notice, we shall catch many hints that will broaden and enlighten into knowledge of the secret of nature. All goes to show that the soul in man is not an organ, but animates and exercises all the organs, is not a function like the power of memory or calculation of comparison, but uses these as hands and feet, is not a faculty, but light. We want to obviously make that note. So he's going to equate it with light, and this will be very Platonic, right? We're back to our cave allegory. Is not the intellect or the will, but the master of the intellect and the will, is the vast background of our being in which they lie. An immensity not possessed, and they cannot be possessed from within or from behind it. Light shines through us upon things, and makes us aware that we are nothing, but the light is all. The man is the facade of a temple wherein all wisdom and all good abide. When what we commonly call man, the eating, drinking, planting, counting man, does not, as we know him, represent himself, but misrepresents himself. And by the way, let's just point out, as we've said in other lectures, Emerson is working with the history of his time, and therefore he's going to use the word man to reference all of humanity. Today, if he were writing, he would use, obviously, gender-appropriate language. Please forgive him for that. Him we do not respect, but the soul, whose organ he is, would he let it appear through his action, would make our knees bend. In other words, we begin to respect and worship the very spirit, if you will, of the second box. When it breathes through his intellect, it's genius. When it breathes through his will, it's virtue. When it flows through his affection, it's love. And the blindness, we think of the cave allegory, of the weakness of the will begins when the individual would be something of himself. All reform aims in some one particular to let the great soul have its way through us. In other words, to engage us to obey. So in other words, this is pure Platonism. We're back to our study of Plato's Republic. If only we would try to follow more the second box, he says, we would have a world that is much happier, much more content. Paragraph 5. He makes an interesting little proverb quote, God comes to us without a bell. And then he will continue with this idea by saying that when we meet this idea, the walls are taken away. We lie open on one side to the depths of spiritual nature, to all the attributes of God, justice we see and know, love, freedom, power. These natures no man ever got above, but always they tower over us, and most in the moment when our interests tempt us to wound us. Paragraph number 6, the Oversoul, he says, contradicts all experience, abolishes time and space. And at times for the world, it has been the sign even of insanity, he says. To continue and finish, he says it this way. And yet, he says, to speak with levity of these limits, in the world, often the sign of insanity. Yet time and space are but inverse measures of the force of the soul. A man is capable of abolishing them both. The spirit sports with time, and then he quotes, can crowd eternity into an hour or stretch an hour to eternity. In other words, to perceive eternity in each moment is freedom. Freedom is faith, as we have often said in 303. The idea is, for Emerson, if we can only live with this realization, we will live in the present, right? Because, of course, in love, there is no past, no future, there is only the present, he will argue, okay? Paragraph number 7, he opens, we are often made to feel that there's another youth and age than that which is measured from the year of our natural birth. This idea, of course, is the fountain of youth. In other words, there's two kinds of aging. There's the aging of the body, which is inevitable because everything sags and bags. But this spirit does not age. And because that's the case, when one taps into it, you'll remember Wordsworth's little ditty, Emerson met Wordsworth's, my heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky, and all of that, right? Such a thought is the love of the universal and eternal beauty. Every man parts from that contemplation with a feeling that it rather belongs to ages than to mortal life. The least activity of the intellectual powers redeems us in a degree from the influences of time. In sickness, in languor, give us a strain of poetry or a profound sentence, and we are refreshed. I don't know, AP students sometimes will debate this, that in fact when you read a good line of poetry, you're refreshed instead of challenged to come up with the next right answer, right? Or produce a volume of Plato or Shakespeare or remind us of their names, and instantly we come into a feeling of longevity. See how the deep divine thought demolishes centuries and millenniums and makes itself present through all ages. And then an interesting question, look at it. Is the teaching of Christ less effective now than it was when his mouth was first opened? It's an interesting question. Now, of course, our idea here is to say that we need to appreciate, or Emerson says, we should appreciate the great ideas, the great thinkers. Why? Because they awaken within us something that we hold to be fundamentally true about our reality. That is to say, those really are shadows on our wall. They're not real. He finishes paragraph 7 by saying, the things we now esteem fixed shall one by one detach themselves like ripe fruit from our experience and fall. It's a nice nature simile. And he finishes, the soul knows only the soul. All else is idle weeds for her wearing. In paragraph number 8, he talks about the math of Oversoul. He says it's not in a straight line that one develops or evolves. It's rather like, and this is a wonderful word picture, metamorphosis. In other words, think of the butterfly. It starts out as a worm before it ends up becoming this amazing butterfly, right? And to that degree, we find ourselves, other than that wonderful word picture from that Bug's Life show, right, from our youth, we find ourselves thinking about the power of how we ourselves are evolving. Think about your own intellectual evolution, even just this year, if you're senior year, right? It's one of those kinds of things where it's like coming out. He uses the term coming out, like coming out of the cave and the bright sun hitting you. And at the moment that you recognize these ideas, you are made somehow more challenged, right, to think. And for Emerson, thinking is always a good thing. He says it in paragraph 9. The soul is superior to purity, to justice, to beneficence, that is to say kindness. Again, we think about Keats, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. He will say it this way, for to the soul, in her pure action, all the virtues are natural and not painfully acquired. Speak to his heart, the man becomes suddenly virtuous. That is to say, this is what real education should be about for Emerson. He says, education should be about speaking directly to this idea of the soul. It's fundamental, he says, to how one should think about education. And of course, this is in many ways Emerson's assumptive phase. Okay, let's quickly turn now to paragraph number 10. He begins it, within the same sentiment is the germ of intellectual growth which obeys the same law. Those who are capable of humility, this is huge, I would write this down because this is an important point. Humility is the key for Emerson. Because if one begins to say that I am God, one is naturally tempted to think that one is talking about one's puny ego. No. When Emerson uses this term, he's talking about the stuff of the second box, and therefore, humility. The power to recognize this, well, he says, bring one to one's spiritual knees. Humility of justice, of love, of aspiration are already on a platform that commands the sciences and art, speech, poetry, action, grace. For whosoever dwells in this moral beauty does already anticipate those special powers which men prize so highly, just as love does justice to all the gifts of the object beloved. And then he finishes, for in ascending to this primary and aboriginal sentiment, we have come from our remote station on the circumference instantaneously to the center of the world, where, as in the closet of God, we see causes and anticipate the universe, which is but a slow effect. We finished part 2 and now turn to part 3, paragraphs 11 through 15, the Oversoul in society, and he will now turn to paragraph number 11, and he'll begin to talk about the idea of forms versus formless. Now what I want you to do in your notes is above these two boxes now, I want you to see how there's going to be a shift that starts to take place in the language, So above the first box, I actually want you to put the word forms. That is to say, over-related to form, okay? Above the second box, put the word formless. Got me? So for example, no question, everything in this first box is a form, right? The human body is a form, right? But mind is formless. Consciousness is formless. Soul is formless. I mean, you can't get 3 pounds of mind. No, it's not the way it works, right? Give me 15 pounds of energy. No, it's not the way it works, right? It is formless. And this is the game that he'll be playing. He'll say it this way. I am certified of a common nature. And so these other souls, these separate selves, draw me as nothing else can. They stir in me the new emotions we call passion of love, hatred, fear, admiration, pity. Thence come conversation, competition, persuasion, cities, and war. We immediately think of Golding's Lord of the Flies. Persons are supplementary to the primary teaching of the soul. In youth, we are mad for persons. Childhood and youth see all the world in them. But the larger experience of man discovers the identical nature appearing through them all. Persons themselves acquaint us with the impersonal. In all conversation between two persons, tacit reference is made as to a third party, to a common nature. The third party or common nature is not social. It is impersonal. It is God. Now, this word impersonal is dangerous for us because it starts to sound like indifferent. And Emerson is not wanting to say that it's indifferent, but rather it is transpersonal, and this is why often that term gets used more. So I would recommend that may be a word for you as you think about this one. That is to say, when human beings come together, they share in common a common nature. Okay, now this is central to understanding Emerson's view of education. Your education is designed, or should be for Emerson, designed to remind you that we somehow are all of the same stuff. We're all of the same stuff. And to that degree, it's an important idea in terms of social cohesion. Okay? Now again, we'll challenge this idea. I think Golding's Lord of Flies, a text that we study, right, is obviously going to challenge this, but then that was already a challenge for us, obviously, in our study of Republic with the Thrasemican question of might makes right, and of course Machiavelli's Prince will bring it as well to the question, right? He says it, together we wax wiser than we were. Right? True learning is that wisdom, and all men and women possess this capacity, not just the educated. He'll say it this way as he goes on. It's theirs. It shines for all of us, he says. There is a certain wisdom of humanity which is common to the greatest men with the lowest, and which our ordinary education often labors to silence and obstruct. The mind is one. And the best minds who love truth for its own sake think much less of property and truth. Thankfully, they accept it everywhere and do not label or stamp it with any man's name, for it is theirs long beforehand. It is theirs from eternity. The learned and the studious of thought have no monopoly of wisdom. And then later he says it in paragraph number 11. We do not yet possess ourselves. We know better than we do, he says. We do not yet possess ourselves, and we know at the same time that we are much more. Paragraph number 12, men descend to meet, reminding us of those opening lines of Republic, I went down to the Piraeus, right? In other words, we live as individuals first, if we are true individuals, and then we descend to meet other individuals on common ground. He has a really interesting word picture about Arabian sheiks, where he says they will, they're very wealthy, but on the outside of their house, they are really poor. They look poor, but on the inside of their house, they like to, decorate it to make it look really nice. It's an interesting word picture. Again, one of my goals here is to just try and introduce you to some of these ideas. We'll ask of you that you are, doing some of this work on your own. All right, let's go to paragraph number 13 really quickly. Here we're going to meet Emerson's pedagogy. We'll think, of course, of Plato's pedagogy. We think of Whitman's pedagogy, borrowed obviously from Emerson. Here's Emerson's pedagogy. Again, just to remind that word, how you should be taught. What's the best way to teach children? And he has an interesting idea in paragraph 13. At its present, in all persons, so it is in every period of life. It is adult already in the infant man. Watch this. In my dealings with my child, obviously education, watch this. In my dealings with my child, my Latin and Greek, my accomplishments and my money stead me nothing. Children could care less if the teacher knows Latin and Greek and has lots of money, he says. They are all lost on it, but as much soul as I have avails. If I am merely willful, in other words, force it on him, he gives me a Roland for an Oliver, sets his will against mine, one for one, and leaves me, if I please, the degradation of beating him by my superiority of strength. In other words, the only thing left for me is me trying to force him into learning something because I'm stronger. But if I renounce my will and act for the soul, setting that up as an umpire between us two, out of his young eyes looks the same soul he reveres and loves with me. In other words, this, we would argue, for schools is the most important state standard. That is to say, love, or passion, we might say, for ideas. In other words, a teacher can only give what a teacher is. We can only share with others what we are. And out of that knowledge, then we grow. Paragraph 14. This is a controversial paragraph because he will say it. We know truth when we see it. He does concede the point in paragraph 14. The soul, he says, is the perceiver and revealer of truth. We know truth when we see it. Let skeptic and scoffer say what they choose. Foolish people ask you, when you have spoken what they do not wish to hear, how do you know it's the truth and not an error of your own? We know truth when we see it. From opinion, he says, as we know when we are awake that we are awake. Of course, this notion of waking up is central, right? It's an interesting idea, and let's put it in our notes. We'll ask this kind of question, right? What is the reason why haters, like think of the KKK, why do they wear the sheet? Why cover up the face? Of course, our classic example of this is played out in history. It's our wonderful study of history. We've talked about it before, haven't we? That notion of Hitler versus Gandhi. Think about the way those two guys lived their lives, but more particularly how they died at the end of their lives, right? For Hitler, that paragon of exclusivity, that hater, how does he die? Hiding in a bunker, trying to save his life. Gandhi, on the other hand, that great proponent of the change you wish to see in the world, that great inclusivist thinker, he's not ashamed of his actions, and so he's willing to stand up and say, yes, I did do these things, I said these things. This is going to be paramount to understanding the Emersonian challenge. Here it is, your own education. Has it prepared you to see and know the truth? Of course, we already asked this question, didn't we, when we were studying Plato's Republic, right? Paragraph number 15. He says it, for the soul's communication of truth is the highest event in nature. For it then does not give somewhat from itself, but it gives itself or passes into and becomes that man whom it enlightens, or in proportion to that truth he receives it, takes him to himself. In other words, education should bring you back to yourself. Now, by self, we don't mean that puny ego in the first box. We're talking about this stuff. It's an interesting question, and we asked it earlier when we were studying Plato. Now we'll ask it again. Has your education helped you to come to a better understanding of this? In your music training, in your athletic training, in your social negotiations. At the conclusion of your high school career, do you find that you are more interested in the stuff of the second box because of your study in the first box? I mean, there's no question. Those are obviously notes on a page. There's no question. The instrument you hold in your hand is obviously real. And yet as you interpret those notes, you become somehow in contact with something called music, or as Mozart said,